people from the London Free Speech Salon here tonight as well, so thank you for coming. And I'm Felice Basball, and I'll be your chair for the evening. So the concept of tyranny, the word tyranny, is thrown around a lot these days. Most of you will be familiar with the way someone like Donald Trump is often portrayed. And I think it's because we're in a world of kind of high political tensions, and we're looking for words that feel severe enough, feel kind of to match the situation. And while the concept of tyranny has been around since ancient Greece, and we'll hear some more about that in a bit, it feels ever more present in political discussions. I listened to a recent Ezra Klein podcast where he was asked whether platforming Trump supporters was normalizing his presidency. And Trump is regularly called a tyrant, around January 6th and these kinds of things. But then you also have a corollary on the right where we often hear things like the tyranny of net zero or the tyranny of DEI. I was reading an article the other day in Quillette that was called The Tyranny of Fragility. There was also an article in the Irish Times recently which dealt with the tyranny of the author's own well-being routine. So, it's a lot of tyranny. So on the one hand, we're looking for words that suit the moment, but on the other hand, we also, it can also come to feel silly, and we think about whether words like tyranny are at risk of losing their meaning. So we look towards what's happening in the Middle East right now and wonder if it's really suitable to call a Donald Trump or a Keir Starmer for a tyrant. So what should we understand by tyranny today, and who are those modern-day tyrants? When is the language of tyranny warranted? And are ancient ideas about tyranny outdated, or can they be useful for understanding the present? So that's why I'm delighted to have here today two great speakers who will help us unpick some of these questions. So first, it's my pleasure to introduce for the first time Dr. Edmund Stewart, who is an associate professor in ancient Greek history at the University of Nottingham, and he's also the director of Tyrannica, the interdisciplinary network for the study of tyrannies, personalist dictatorships, and authoritarian regimes. We're really delighted to have Edmund here today, who will explore some of the ancient ideas of tyranny and the way they're used and abused today. And second, I want to introduce Alastair, who is the convener of Living Freedom and also the co-convener of the Battle of Ideas Festival, which will be celebrating its 20th anniversary in October this year. And Alastair will be looking at some of the different ways tyranny is conceived of today. And together, I think these two will provide a great starting point for our discussion. So if you'll please give them all a big hand. And I will give each of our speakers about 10 to 12 minutes to walk us through some of their thoughts, and then I'll bring it out to the audience. And for those of you who haven't been to a Living Freedom event before, the way we do it is that we take a few questions from the audience before we bring it back to the panel. So I would advise my panelists to have a notebook and a pencil ready, and you to think about your questions as the two of them are speaking. So to start us off, would you all please welcome Dr. Edmund Stewart.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here at Living Freedom, which is, I've only known about this initiative for a couple of months, but it's wonderful getting to know you all and seeing the excellent things and interesting things that you've been doing. Of course, we all, I suspect everyone in this room maybe, thinks freedom is something that's important. But I often think about the way I often think about freedom is a bit like the way in which certain churches advertise God or salvation. You sometimes see these signs, turn to Jesus to be saved. And the problem is, well, if you don't know what salvation is or what being saved means, you're not really going to be converted or interested. I think freedom is little bit the same. And there are people who don't understand or the value of freedom, or think that freedom is something of potentially a bad thing. So I think we need to keep in mind first that freedom must be for some purpose. Freedom is not an end, it is a means to an end. So philosophers, such as Plato, for example, would say in his Republic, well, the aim of a political community, our aim is to produce not just a free society, but a just society, a good society. And this, of course, will be a free society as well in certain ways because its opposite is an unfree society, the most unfree society of all, a tyranny. And the other way to think about it, I think, is you can only really understand the value of freedom if you know its opposite, unfreedom, the lack of freedom. And there are lots of kinds of situations where we may lack freedom, but I'm going to be focusing, we are focusing tonight, I should say, on the particular kind which is not all the kinds that were just mentioned, the tyranny of my work regime or whatever like this, the tyranny of my boss, for example, but is tyranny at a political level. This is the manipulation, the domination of individuals at the level of the state. And this is the most dangerous and pernicious kind, because after all, you can avoid a tyrannical boss. You can get another job. That may be difficult, it may be unpleasant, it may be frightening, but you can do it. In a tyranny, there is no escape, unless into exile. There's no escape even for the tyrant, even for the tyrant's advisors. They're all trapped and frightened in many cases. So what is tyranny, very briefly, and I'm going to rattle through these as quickly as possible. Tyranny is the monopolization of state power for the benefit of one individual and in a small group of individuals around that person. So they are manipulating, they are channeling the resources of the state, and also all other things less tangible, like honor, political office, everything that makes the Aristotelian good life is being channeled upwards to this one pinnacle, and then little bits of it are then filtered, sprinkled down in the form of patronage. And this circulation it binds the people of the tyrant and the people in the state to the tyrant in these bonds of reciprocity and patronage. So this idea of tyranny, it, as was mentioned just earlier, is an ancient idea, an ancient Greek term, although it wasn't a Greek word, tyrannos. And originally, they borrowed it from the Hittites because they could see these very powerful Near Eastern rulers who had huge palaces and were drawing in resources to those palaces. And they used this term, this Eastern term, to refer to their own rulers, the rulers that they knew in the small world of these many fragmented Greek city-states, or what the Greeks called polis, where we get our word political from. So these are quite small, as I've said, it's quite small polities. They may, in terms of citizens, and in this case we're talking all men above the age of 30, in most cases, we may be talking about maybe only 1,000. We may be talking in a big state like Athens, 30,000 perhaps, with an overall population of maybe 300,000 to 400,000. So not very large at all. And in these kinds of states where they were beginning to develop the kinds of mechanisms, the institutions of state control, similar to what we find in our modern societies, it is possible, even with very limited technology, very limited communications, to have a very high level of control over the individuals within that state. Think, for example, as well, of a cult in the modern world. A cult may have as many as a few hundred, maybe a few thousand members at most. But a cult leader is able, in many cases, think of, actually, I'm not going to mention any names because that might be embarrassing. That might be controversial. But a cult leader is usually able to control those individuals to a much higher degree than many dictators. Even people like Hitler, for example, were able to control Germans under the Third Reich. So actually, the state capacity is not as important. It's the size of the state. Now, the problem is, over time, it's very hard to scale up that kind of state. The only really successful occasion where we have an ancient state which is very large, but also has a very large bureaucracy, which is able to control all aspects of life within the state, is, for example, the Qin Empire in China in the 3rd century, in the Qin dynasty. If you look at an empire like the Roman Empire, that essentially was a Greek-style city-state, which then got an empire. And these emperors are actually only able, they can of course increase tax, they can insist on rule and law and order, but they are not actually necessarily controlling the whole, everyone who is your average man on the street in, say, Gaul or Syria, for example, in the Roman Empire. So in the tyranny of the ancient model, the model known to people like Plato and Aristotle, really comes of age again in the modern world. Particularly in the 20th century, tyrannies can appear at any time in any part of the world, but they particularly need a sweet spot, which is where institutions are weak and they can be taken over. And so a tyranny, rather like a mafia, is kind of virus on the city-state. You take it over and then you control it for your own purposes. But those institutions not only have to be weak, they also have to be strong enough at the same time to become tools for control. So if you think, for example, in many post-independence African states, we have really personalist dictatorships. Some of the most nasty dictatorships, people like Idi Amin, people like Mobutu in the Congo. And they are able to exploit the growth of institutions, these institutions enforced upon by colonial powers, upon these post-colonial states, but constitutions and institutions which had not been embedded in, which were weak. So they were able to capitalize on that unusual sweet, or one might say bitter spot there. So these kinds of dictatorships are a very particular type of dictatorship. They're not the same. Not all dictatorships are the same. This is a very non-ideological dictatorship. It's a dictatorship which involves high levels of personalist power. The leader has complete control over the inner circle and cannot be easily overthrown by that inner circle. These kinds of dictatorships are also highly corrupt, highly kleptocratic. Their main, really only aim, they don't have an ideological aim beyond sucking up, as I said, sucking up the resources for the leader, basically in the same way that an ancient tyranny works. Now, these used to be, as I've said, quite rare. Only about 20% of dictatorships, non-democracies in about 1980 were of this type, places like Africa, the Caribbean, etc. When we get to 2010, that number has gone up to 40%, and in the present time, it might stand at somewhere between 50 and 60%. And there are two reasons for this. One, there's been a decline in the power of there's been a decline in single-party dictatorships and in the power of parties, ideological parties, to control the leader. The second element is the growth of personalist dictatorships are networking. They're gaining inspiration. They're learning from each other. And the big personalist dictatorships of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping are becoming inspirations, leading a lot of states. Think of Belarus and Kazakhstan, in Syria as well, to a certain extent. Putin was able to support those dictatorships, and also in the case of somewhere like Belarus, to nurture them, to turn them into more personalistic dictatorships, more in the model of Putin's Russia. So this is very worrying, but you may at this point be saying, well, you know, as the question that was raised earlier, okay, so what's the difference between this and Trump? How can we tell the difference? Well, very briefly, there are at least 6 ways in which we can tell the difference, 6 criteria which we can empirically, we can examine empirically, and we can say, we should be able to develop a framework where we can definitely say, this is a tyranny and this is not. And it's a tyranny, again, in the same way in which Plato or Aristotle would have understood it. And very briefly, the things that really set a tyrant from someone like Donald Trump is control of weapons. Has the dictator hoarded weapons, for example, in the presidential palace? as, for example, Francois Duvalier did in Haiti? Does he have a personal militia, the kind of thing like the Special Republican Guard of Saddam Hussein? 15,000, the most well-equipped troops. Ooh, excuse me, is that me? That's really bad.
The
tyranny of phone calls. I do apologise. Because I was the speaker, I did not think to turn my phone off.
Well, I didn't think to
because I was only
people,
offending myself. So where was I? Control of appointments. Can the leader control the career of the people who support them? Is the institution a rubber stamp? The Russian State Duma, of course, has opposition parties, but they do not give meaningful opposition. Can the tyrant build patronage networks of the kind I've just mentioned? And is the tyrant able to exile or eliminate rivals in order to prevent that tyrant to be overthrown? Now, I've just been talking for too long, but I'm just going to mention very briefly the consequences, some of the consequences of all of this. These states are more belligerent, more corrupt, more repressive than any other, not only than democracies, but than any other kind of dictatorship. But more than that, they have a moral and psychological degenerative effect on everyone within those states. And there are at least three types of people in the state. There is the tyrant and what I would call the tyrant's people. And these are people who become courtiers to the tyrant. The tyrant is now the source of all the good things, everything that could give you the good life in the society. The only source, ideally, if it's really personalized dictatorship. So these people are constantly chivying for access to the tyrant. Think, for example, of Henry VIII, of Louis XIV. Watch Wolf Hall if you haven't recently. This is the kind of situation that is going on, but it's much more intense, much more dangerous, because the tyrant's people, unlike the aristocracy, don't have really any reason to be there. Most of them have just been brought up by the tyrant. They're not dukes or counts or anything like that. The second group of people are the people on the street, the people who just want to survive. And the tyranny aims to make them docile, small. Aristotle would talk about these people as being made small-souled. And then the final group is the tyrant's enemies, the dissidents in the state. And this is a small group. It's about the same size as the tyrant's people, the tyrant's supporters. And it's been constantly winnowed out as people are sent to prison or being forced into exile. And yet, strangely enough, it keeps on growing. And the reason for that is that there is a basic human will to be free. Unfortunately, there is also a will at the same time to dominate other people, and sometimes those wills are not mutually exclusive. But there is basically a natural, inherent will of human beings to be free. And that can be suppressed, but it cannot be destroyed forever. So ultimately, I think the great conflict of our time, which is currently ongoing, whether or not people in London or Washington or anywhere else notice or care, is a war not between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, as Marx foresaw, for example, but between the tyrants and the tyrants' people and the tyrannized. And the tyrannized, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Burma, in all of these places, in Taiwan, there are constant movements to fight against the tyrants, to be free. And the tyrants are always aware of this. They are always working to keep freedom and free people down. It is the one thing they do, the only thing they do efficiently, the only thing they do well. Everything else, apart from corruption, they do abysmally. But that is the one thing that they do well. And if we are going to see that the world is free, we had better be doing the opposite a bit better. But thank you very much. I've probably spoken too long.
Thank you very much. I think that was really useful, and I really like the sort of three types you set out at the end there, and I think we might be able to get into those a little bit later. I know, Alastair, you have some words as well, and then we'll get into the discussion, so take it away.
Okay, thanks. Since knowing I was going to do this talk and looking into tyranny and some of the background to it, I suppose I've been quite surprised by just how common the usage is of tyranny these days. I didn't expect to find it just quite so prevalent. If you find out for yourselves, if you pop tyranny into a search engine of your Amazon account or into Google News, you'll find pages and pages of returns covering hundreds of books and articles. Now, some of them are obviously fairly clickbaity stuff. The Spectator actually seems particularly keen on tyranny headlines. You'll find them covering the tyranny of 20-mile-per-hour speed limits, tyranny of World Book Day, the tyranny of voice notes, the tyranny of self-service checkouts, even the tyranny of singing Happy Birthday. And my own favourite, the tyranny of 1970s self-help gurus. Who would have thought? In works to be taken a little bit more seriously, we find tyranny of all sorts of different things, a bit as Felice outlined in her introduction, tyranny of experts, of merit, of fear, faith, science, words. There's teenage tyranny, judicial tyranny, green tyranny. Predictably, we have the likes of Russia, Venezuela, and Iran, who are thought to be tyrannical states, but also Mexico, Israel, and Canada, a bit more surprisingly, probably to some. And we don't just have tyrannical leaders, but we have these generic types of tyrants, lawyers, tech bros, the civil service. Tyranny is everywhere. One way I think of understanding just why tyranny now seems to loom at every turn is to see it as part of what we could say is a broader problem. The demise of any sort of workable political vocabulary for the world that we live in. Long established meanings of political categories. We're all used to thinking about how outdated they seem. Conservatism or liberalism are increasingly kind of distorted in their meanings and hollowed out. And into that space steps all sorts of new terms, made up labels like cultural Marxist and strange but somehow quite appropriate terms I'm increasingly finding, things like cancel culture and two-tier and even woke actually I think increasingly has its place as a descriptive term. So it seems to me that kind of tyranny to some extent is just one of these words that's crept into our political landscape because it's kind of lazy shorthand for things and we don't quite have the political vocabulary just now for a lot of things that we want to describe. And I think it's a very important issue actually, this kind of loss of political language. It's so important in fact that Ideas Matter, which is the charity that organises Living Freedom, is organising its summer school this year around the question of upheaval, why politics needs a new language. And I think there's flyers floating around that you can find out a bit more about that. It would be very nice to see you there with us in July. But for this purposes of this discussion, my starting point really is that tyranny is too often ill-conceived, ahistorical and throwaway, which is why I think the work that Edmund's doing in terms of trying to understand the origins and evolution of the concept is actually quite important. And taking stock, looking at all the things that I read, it seemed to me that broadly speaking, very loosely, tyranny seems to be applied in three different ways. There's the kind of what are often labelled autocrats or dictators, collectively the rulers of Autocracy Inc., if anybody knows the Anne Applebaum book that was published last year. And then there's and again Edmund mentioned these, the kind of populist strongman types, of which Trump is definitely the primary target of that discussion. And then thirdly, and this is the one I want to talk about most, is what a stretch might be labelled woke or technocratic type current tyrannies, those societies that are dominated by the pursuit of what we might call, and this is me being loose in language as well, progressive agendas. I'm going to skip over the autocrats largely, other than just to say that I do have a little bit of sympathy for Anne Applebaum's point in her book that the almost cartoon-like image of autocrats as bad men that control the army and the police and keep control of society through violence, I think does carry the risk of overlooking a kind of wider set of historical and political and cultural trends and circumstances that give birth to these things. I mean, it is a kind of figure of evil sometimes to the exclusion of all other discussions. On populist strongmen, just a couple of quick points on this. I mean, firstly, beyond the mistake of trying to label populists as tyrants, I think we really actually should note the destructive consequences of this for wider society. You only got to look really at the American elections when the Democrats concentrated on labelling Trump a fascist and playing on the kind of politics of fear. And instead of developing a genuinely compelling vision of the future, it was democracy really that lost out, to my mind. The electorate was deprived of that one, the very thing that democracies need, which is a kind of viable political vision of the future, that they have a choice of what to pick from. So it's kind of that discussion in itself undermined, I think, democracy. And secondly, compared to the elected populists, it's actually, in many ways, their opponents that come across as the much more anti-democratic and indeed tyrannical figures. One of the well-documented facets of a tyranny is the undermining of the rule of law, which in the hands of tyrants is very much treated as a tool and a weapon, which can be cherry-picked or ignored as the results, to the desires of the tyrant. And we've seen in the elections in the US, and very much in the discussion around populist parties and leaders in Europe, a real trend towards mounting firewalls around the discussion of populism to stop the spread of ideas, often enacted through kind of strange aspects of the Constitution, or sometimes acts such as the EU's Digital Services Act or hate crime laws, all of which serve to dampen down the discussion on what I think are important political ideals. So in many ways it's the anti-populists who display some of the more tyrannical tendencies, I think. But the thing I really want to speak about, woke tyrannies, I mean, I'm calling them woke tyrannies. I don't know if that's a good label or not, probably not. Now, and just a caution, we need to avoid getting drawn down a conspiratorial route here, because the act of tyrants are often understood to mean fairly deliberate and planned attempts to monopolise power. And I don't think that we live in a world where woke tyrants plan their domination by cynically deploying plans for COVID lockdowns or debanking or deviously plan to open borders purely in the interests of undermining the influence of domestic populations. That's all kind of a little bit deliberate and conspiratorial to me. But in fact, if you think about the way that European states operate these days, it's anything but deliberate. I mean, they're characterised by their inability, if anything, to plan anything, by their disorientation and a kind of timid, fearful, quite risk-averse nature. They stumble into decisions, really, rather than proactively take them. But I do think there's another way of looking at tyranny, and this is kind of where maybe I kind of take a different route than Edmund, who you talked mostly about tyrants, and I think my interest is more in the condition of tyranny, actually, and how that works. So less in the classical sense of the tyrant leader, but more based on tyranny as, I don't know, what you might call effectively the cumulative experience of a people who occupy a society and how they live and how it is that they're governed. And I don't know if anybody knows the Substacker academic David McGrogan, who very good Substack. I really recommend everybody seeks out that Substack. He's written on what he calls a tyrannical tendency, where contemporary cultural and technological trends combine with political developments to create an experience that's a kind of inchoate form of tyranny. And he cites Aristotle's The Politics. I know I'm a dangerous guy in getting into a discussion on Aristotle with a classical scholar, but in particular, he's interested in the section of the book where it discusses the measures that can be taken to preserve a tyranny. So much less on the tyrant itself. And these measures that he outlines, I'm not going to talk about all of them, but let me just list off a few because I think they're quite interesting. So he talks about getting rid of men of independent spirit, of undermining gatherings in clubs or in education to avoid breeding grounds of learning, independence, and people getting to know each other well. He talks about keeping dwellers in the city always within view, performing servile actions, lest they gain a spirit of their own. He talks about stirring up strife and setting friends against friends, leaders who make themselves guardians and stewards of the public's resources, creating the belief that we owe our safety to a regime where leaders appear trustees of our affairs and servers of the common good, and reliance on the foreign-born to help secure ongoing rule. And I think it's quite an interesting list of things that he identifies, because I think you can see whether deliberate or not, and I'm suggesting not deliberate in some of the actions and politics of society today, you can see many of those things in the world that we live in. Again, I really need to stress, I'm not arguing that we live today under tyrannical figures deliberately planning these outcomes. No one sets out, I think, deliberately to quash an independent spirit, for example. But nevertheless, I think some of these things arise out of the cultural and political conditions that of society today. Being suspicious, being safety conscious, where we demand surveillance to keep us safe. That's very much a kind of way that we live today. We live in a world which is identity driven and sets potential friends apart. We live in an anti-intellectual climate hostile to independent thinking. And terrified to follow its own instincts rather than take advice of experts. We live in a world where public and private spheres have very much started to break down. So I think all of those things are kind of quite recognizable in what Aristotle was talking about, all of which means that our experience today is one where I think we can take something out of these historical works about tyranny and try and kind of grapple with these concepts and see how it is that they apply not just to the autocrats in the East or Africa, as it were, or whichever one is the latest, but in some of the conditions of our own Western societies as well. According to Aristotle, preserving tyranny is to create a world where citizens have no mutual confidence, no power, little spirit. It seems to me that that's a kind of condition that's worth challenging and starting to address.
Thank you very much. Can we give both speakers a hand? So I think it's really interesting. We've been very sort of wide around here, and I think it's both of you have touched on kind of some of the central tenets in the kind of ancient Greek thought here. But I also think it's interesting that I think, Edmund, you talked mostly about the kind of dichotomy, the difference between the tyrannies we see across the Middle East when you look, abroad versus the free societies we supposedly live in here. And I think, while I'm not one to sort of talk about the world we live in here as a tyranny, I think it's quite interesting that Alastair kind of takes some of these questions and flips them on their heads. So I want to bring it out to the audience now. If any of you have any thoughts on what our speakers have been saying, I think particularly a lot of what brings us here at Living Freedom and is this feeling. We want to gather here. We want to talk about things. So. Are there any thoughts from the audience to these two speakers? Otherwise, I definitely, yes, Tom?
I was very interested by, I think both of you sort of touched on the fact that obviously fear is a giant component of tyranny, and the sort of self-regulation of a tyranny is, by how fearful of whatever consequences people are. I guess the context for me finding it very interesting is I'm sorry to sort of do an argument out of anecdote, but I was recently having a conversation with someone from a very different background to me, from a very different part of the world to me, and I would be very well inclined to believe they would die for a lot less than I would. They came from a far less comfortable place. I'm comparatively mollycoddled, and I guess I'd be really interested to hear both of your thoughts on sort of the extent to which a tyranny is defined by how easy it is or isn't to tyrannise someone. Sort of, where does that stop come? But I guess that's, sorry, thinking out loud there, but that's...
No, really, what is the breeding ground for a tyranny in different places? Do I have any other comments? Yes, over there.
Well, I wasn't sure what I would comment on, and that just gave me inspiration. That last comment just gave me inspiration to comment, because I think, pick up on that thread, it's almost sort of counterintuitive that as society has become as, for example, to use one analogy, racism has decreased in society, the use of the term racism has increased. And similarly, as perhaps in many respects, tyranny has decreased, or at least it's found it can be found in various forms that we may not have traditionally associated with tyranny. Yet the word has increased in frequency, and perhaps a lot of it is to do with our perceptions. So if we live in a more free world, or a more comfortable world where we are not faced with the reality of, imminent hardship of literally, starving to death or having to be forced to conscripted into war as men, then perhaps we inevitably find our whole perspective has shifted, and that we find tyranny in things that wouldn't have been considered tyrannical previously. In other words, maybe we're all just rather privileged and lack gratitude.
Yes, are we overblowing it? Do I have any other? I saw a hand over there as well. Yes.
Just wondering if there's a possibility that you might think that there is within everyone, besides a will to freedom, a will to submit. You see a lot of evidence towards this in terms of people voting in sort of strongmen across the world, or seeming popularity of people like Putin within Russia, ostensibly. You don't know how well those numbers are, but you have in Gaza voting Hamas back in after they gave them elections. You have also maybe a tendency to vote in strongman type figure, for example, Trump. Also maybe something towards stability and people promising that, like Starmer versus, say, Liz Truss, successfully panned for, framed for what happened with the economy. And with submission, you get different things than freedom gives. For example, like Islam is named after the term submission, right? That's another meaning for it, I believe. And there's a fundamental, it seems, tendency for people to maybe prefer that over, say, the idea of freedom. For example, continuing wearing hijabs or veiling yourself. It's continuing in the West, even in second generation Islamic communities. You don't necessarily see an organic rise in will to freedom happening in the world.
Yeah, I
so
think.
Push back on the idea that there's just the will to freedom.
Yeah, it's interesting as well with some of the tyrannies Alastair was talking about before, that there seems, a lot of them, there seems to be a drive for it. I think, some interesting comments about comfort. Do I have one last point before yes, over there.
Thanks, please. I think politics, I want to agree with what Alastair was saying. I think these terms, left, right, liberal, conservative, Labour, whatever, they don't mean anything in politics today. I actually think the debate that we see in the world, and you see this whichever democratic country you look at, is about technocrats and populists. And the prevailing narrative that we get told is that the technocrats are on your side. They understand how the world works. They've got this education. They've got this background. They know what they're doing. And the evil populists are just trying to stir up all this hate, and they're against you. And I actually think you might agree with that. You might disagree with that. But I think the narrative is changing. And I think actually people are starting to feel that the tyrants might just be the technocrats, because we've had a system of whatever politics. We have had people in charge that have sort of come from the system itself for about hundreds of years now, and nobody feels that anyone has the answers. And maybe, just maybe, call me controversial, the people that are actually going into politics saying they're trying to support people that live in that country, trying to put policies forward that will help people rather than tax them or take their money away to fund other projects. Maybe they're the ones that are on your side, and maybe, just maybe, the people that are coming up with policies that feel like they're actually hurting ordinary people in the country are the ones that are out to get you.
Very nice. I saw one more hand, and then I'll bring it back to the panel.
John Stuart Mill very famously talks about the tyranny of the majority. Is that a contradiction in terms?
All right, so we have a few points. I'll bring back in reverse order, perhaps, or yes. So, Alastair, if you want to have a go at some of those questions.
Oh, blimey, so many. Well, the will to freedom, and I mean, I think, I mean, maybe it's worth talking about democracy first and foremost, because it does seem to me that there's, to some extent, the kind of discussion of tyranny is predicated on a lack of confidence in democracy. I mean, the Western world finds it difficult to stand up for its own democratic values. I think there was a survey earlier this week that showed some quite a substantial proportion of young people no longer have much confidence in democracy and would prefer a strong leader. So I think it's perhaps not overly surprising that the figure of the tyrant gains a bit of credence and a bit of airtime, as it were, in a situation where we ourselves find it pretty difficult to stand up for democracy. And even in the sense of you think about perhaps the changes in the 20th century, the tyrant was the totalitarian figure, I think. That we all talked about totalitarianism and the shift at the end of the Cold War, where the world fundamentally changed in terms of that Cold War division. But it does seem to me that the Western world didn't have the strength of ideals and even the strength and the dynamism, economic dynamism, to be able to prove attractive to lots of the rest of the world. So I think what I'm saying is we ourselves do have to take a little bit of responsibility for the situation. Where I might disagree a little bit is the Trump's strongman point. I mean, the voting for Putin thing as well, actually. I mean, votes do not really count for very much in a context of Russia or in some of the Middle Eastern countries where it's not free and fair elections, so they're a little bit meaningless. But in the situation of Trump, I think it's wrong to see him as the strongman. I think it's much more incisive and useful to see him as representative of a certain mood of disquiet in American society, and indeed populists in Europe represent a mood of anxiety and disquiet amongst the way that people have been treated over the past 20, 30 years. So in that sense, I would read that as much more akin to an upswell of kind of democratic ambition, as it were, as opposed to a strongman figure who's just kind of, and I know you didn't say this, but the way it's often presented is fooling the electorate into voting for him. I don't really see that it works in that way. Do you want me to do more?
Yeah. So if you take one, maybe if you take one more question and then. Otherwise, if you're. Yeah.
Well, why don't you give Edmund a go, and I'll come back on another one.
Edmund, go ahead.
Thanks. I'm going to try and sort of collect all of the ideas that came up together, and I hope I answer all of your points, and also some of Alastair's as well. So I think the most important thing is to differentiate. We've got two sets of problems here, and we've got problems in democracies, which are real, like Britain, like many other, actually most other democracies across the world. And we've got problems in non-democracies. And the problems in democracies, I think, are mostly in places like Britain and America. We've got a problem with the over-creation of elites or elite aspirants. We have, and now I shouldn't say this because I'm part of the problem, but we have too many graduates. We have too few professional jobs, so we are creating aspirants to a decent middle-class society at a huge rate, and we're not able to fulfill those aspirations. And we're also seeing, at the same time, we're seeing a greater bureaucratization of the workplace, less autonomy, particularly among the professions, and this, I think, all of it is causing this kind of breakdown of the party system that we're seeing in Britain, we see it in France, Germany, many other countries, that yes, you have maybe 40, 50%, the Pew Research Foundation has shown in many European countries, people are disenchanted with democracy. That's a huge number of potential floating voters. So we do have serious problems, and we do also take the point about woke tyranny. And I think, so what we have is, in part, a failing democracy, where we're starting to see authoritarian tendencies, this kind of, again, wanting a democracy that works, and therefore wanting a strong ruler, I think leads to a desire for authoritarianism in places like India, where the desire for a strongman leader is a frightening 60% or thereabouts. And therefore you have the Modi government and the erosion of democracy in India. But you also, yes, have this woke tyranny. Now, I don't think woke is tyranny, but there are similarities, and I think it's reasonable to point to those similarities. And I think the reason for this is that, and here I may say something controversial, or maybe not in this room, I don't know. But I think woke is essentially, it's a totalist ideology, or ideologies, because obviously it has many elements, and woke is an imperfect term for it. And that means it's an ideology that is trying to make sense of the world in a simple way to give certainty, in much the same way that totalitarian ideologies also do. But I think there's an important difference between what one might call woke and what I would call tyranny, is that I would say it is a totalist ideology, or even, again, to be controversial, effectively a cult, but without a leader. There is no leader. There may be a leader, and at which point it would become more dangerous. But at the moment it relies on individual grassroots activists who are not connected to any political party or any single movement. So from that perspective, I don't see it as a major, it is a problem, but it is not going to overthrow democracy. Neither is Donald Trump, unless things change massively, which they may do. He may be able to centralize power, but he wasn't able to do it in his last presidency. He has some control over the Republican Party, but he has still a small majority, which he could easily lose, because he doesn't dominate the careers, the lives of the people in the party. So I think, so there are problems, they're real, but they're not as frightening as real tyranny. And just going to, oh, sorry, am I talking too long?
Take the last point.
So just to answer the other side of things, so yes, tyranny is a society that is completely dominated by fear. And this is fear that affects loss of, in the most extreme forms in North Korea, for example, it is fear of losing privileges, which would result in starvation. And of course, that is taking it to a real extreme, and we might say there are different levels as how far you can go, and also how widespread the fear is. It may be that the dictatorship only needs to frighten certain people, anyone who sticks their head above the parapet as a democracy activist, for example. But just
one last point.
Yeah. Sorry.
Or can I maybe actually bring it out and then?
Sorry,
So no, it's just so I think some of the things that I'd really like to, maybe if we get the audience back in, or if Alastair wants to make another point first. But this idea of whether tyranny has to be deliberate, because I think you kind of fall on the side of that you need a tyrant to have a tyranny, and that one of the reasons that you can't describe something as woke, something like woke, as a tyranny, is that it needs a tyrant, and it can't be undeliberate in a tyranny. But I think some of what Alastair was pointing to before is that all of these components of a tyranny, can you have a tyrannized sort of population? Can you have people who feel crippled by these bureaucracies and these different ailments and does that effectively qualify as a tyranny? I think if maybe we could, if Alastair, you have another thought, or I'll bring it out to the audience again if there's, yes, I see a few hands.
Well, go out if you want, and I'll come back. We should answer the tyranny of the majority question at some point, but I'll come back.
Well, do you want to answer the tyranny of the majority question?
No, go out.
Okay, Heather, go ahead. Sorry.
Do women make better tyrants?
Very interesting. Yeah,
Can you
Dennis.
suggest one?
It might be quite interesting to try and find a woke Alcibiades somewhere. And, you know, I'm as interested, well, not as an expert like you are interested in Greek, but it can mislead you into what tyranny is. I mean, I think, you know, your 6 criteria, I don't know whether they're necessarily sufficient or what they are, but the obvious example that hasn't come up is Ursula von der Leyen, right? And the European Union, which probably doesn't meet many of your criteria, but it's, if you like, a quiet tyranny who regulates all our lives, you know, and it's led by people like Radka who don't care about their country and just walk off to a more cosmopolitan world when they've finished doing the damage they do. They don't care. Whether they meet the criterion of tyrants, they don't identify the 30 tyrants in Europe. They're not going to do that. But it's like, that is a sort of form of tyranny through regulation that might not, it's not obviously woke, but aspects of it may be. But it affects every single one of our lives every minute of the day, and we don't see it. So, I'm not sure that the classical idea, Darius II or whatever, as the tyrant helps us in this situation. So, is Ursula von der Leyen a tyrant?
Good question. A hand back, all the way back there. Yeah.
I guess like we're sort of describing feeling like we're living in a tyrannised society without having a tyrant and without being in a tyranny. But I guess my question is sort of a little bit about, like, we're not to say that people can't lose their jobs about misspeaking things. Those threats are real to some extent, but actually, like, where's the courage just to stand up against a sense of being tyrannised when there isn't really anyone? There's forces acting on us, but we don't live under a tyrant. And I wonder whether, like, what your thoughts were about how societies do find courage to flip. And I wonder when you look at very consensus-based countries like Sweden, where narratives change, they suddenly change very quickly, where suddenly politicians will come out and just all of a sudden start saying, we've been naive, we need to change the way we look at things like mass migration. And the kind of flip, it doesn't happen and then it happens very suddenly. And I wonder what you thought some of the forces or factors might be to kind of make more bravery to flip out.
Yeah, there. Yeah.
So I'm thinking sort of you were talking about how tyranny, you need a tyrant, and thinking sort of the Hobbesian view of Leviathan. So the reason for that, the need for the Leviathan, the tyrant, is the opposite is the state of nature, chaos. So is chaos just a sort of undirected tyranny in itself? Like I'm thinking also with like post-Gaddafi Libya and things like that. That was the flip side of a single person tyranny is tyranny of everyone.
Yeah. All right, a last point here.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was just thinking about that point that you made about institutional weakness / strength as a requirement for a tyranny to be established. With Louis XIV, it's clear that you can see that him sort of becoming the archetype of the absolutist, he created a system, an institutional system in which everything was revolving around him. So if you brought him the towel in the morning to wash himself, you were more important than the guy who brought him the fruit at the table. So everyone had to be orbiting around him. When he died and then his great-grandson Louis XV took over, he didn't have the same power to convince people about this tyrannical system that he was supposed to lead, and Louis XVI even less so. So the institutional framework was there, but when it fell, eventually, it was strong enough for the revolutionaries to take over and basically inhabit the carcass of the absolutist system that Louis XIV had created. That's the thesis by Alexis de Tocqueville. But one thing is, I don't believe that is necessarily the tyrant that emanates, it's just that they convince us with a narrative that they are the elected individual or the elected group of people who will lead this new tyrannical system. And in the case of the revolution, it was rationalism. That's, would you say perhaps that a tyranny is not necessarily an individual, but it is the discourse that they have?
Okay, Edmund, do you want to go first and take a few points, whatever?
Yeah, indeed. Thank you. Let's start with women tyrants and also roll in Ursula von der Leyen, who conveniently is a woman, so that's very easy for me. The answer is, well, I would say that actually this is something we could perhaps debate, but I think in history there have been no women tyrants. With the exception, I think, where you could say where women have come to power because of the relationship to the ruling men. Now, I'm not going to suggest reasons for why that is the case, and please do feel free to try and offer some exceptions, but I don't think there are any. And which brings me to Ursula von der Leyen, who is not a tyrant as far as I would say what a tyrant is. And I think it's because, not because she's a woman, but because the European Union, one may disagree with, and this is why I think, you may say technocracy is tyrannical. Well, it's not really, or it's not really in the sense, so in a classical sense of tyranny is not rule, the rule of the law, but is rule by means of law. And I think the European Union has its, one may say it has its faults. I'm sure many people disagree on that question. We're not going to talk about Brexit, but it is an institution that does, where there is, I think, the rule of law, even though you might say it is very bureaucratic and sclerotic and all the rest of the problems that may be the case with the European Union. So I think that there is a major difference that I would say. And I think the same is true of the tyranny of the majority. The tyranny of the majority is potentially unstable. It may be, that there may be a majority, and the majority may be able to force through what it wants to do in that moment may seem tyrannical. But in democracies, these kinds of majorities, these kinds of coalitions are very fragile, and they're becoming more and more unstable and fragile in the present day. A tyranny is not fragile. Well, it is. It could collapse very easily. We saw that in Syria. But while it is in existence, it is not fragile at all, because there is no real debate. There are no court cases. The tyrant is never summoned to a court case. There doesn't need to be one, because everything happens as he wishes. He doesn't have to fight any battles, any political battles at all, because while he can have control, if those happen, if an election happens and he loses, which was the case in Venezuela, was the case in Burma, very recently, then the tyrant has two choices. The tyrant can either give in to the will of the people, in which case it is no longer a tyranny, or the tyrant can show his true colours and use force to prevent, as has been the case in Venezuela, prevent the will of the people coming to be. And just going back to that earlier point, actually, about the will to submit, do we actually know what the will of a tyrannized people is? In both of those situations, oddly enough, the dictatorship thought it was popular enough to win an election and was surprised. And it was surprised because there is no free media, there's no free polling, so it has no idea really how popular it is. And in the case of the Burmese junta, they live in their own compounds. They're completely separated from the rest of the population. So they didn't know how much they were hated, really. They believed their own propaganda. Anyway, sorry, I've talked enough.
No, and I think a really interesting point was brought up over here, and perhaps a challenge to Alastair, which is, is it just because the fact that you fear that you're living in a tyranny, is that what's making people not act? Or can you actually describe it as a tyranny? Is what needs just a bit of courage? Or can you actually describe these regulations that were brought up over here as a tyranny, these woke tyrannies you talked about earlier?
All right, well, before I deal with that, let me come back. So a couple of the questions sort of around here about what are we talking about in terms of tyrants and tyranny. In your introduction, Edmund, you talked about the polity and the kind of 500 person unit, and obviously a couple of thousand years ago that's kind of made sense in the way that cities or units of society works, whereas these days it's kind of a completely alien. So the world has completely and utterly changed to the extent that I can get a message to someone in America quicker than probably someone could get a message to one of their colleagues within the 500 polity. So the world has changed. So my understanding always of why it is that it's so interesting and important to go back to great classical works is because by reading them, it helps you think about some of the conditions that you face today. Not in the sense that you're necessarily trying to find what's in that work in a way that you can directly apply it to contemporary society, which has completely changed, but because the way that people talked, the authors that wrote at that time dealt with incredibly deep human problems that, as they appeared to them then. And today we can, perhaps, not all the time, I think, because some things you probably want to ignore, but a lot of the time it can help us rethink our world today. And that's why the bit of the politics that was interesting to me and appealed as a kind of way of trying to help me think about the situation today was that whole section where it talks about the preservation of a tyranny rather than the act of the tyrant. So that was very much what my focus, it's just what I found interesting. It's not to say that the figure of the tyrant is not interesting, it obviously is, but for me, living in today's world, it's the kind of condition of what are the conditions that make for a tyranny, and they raise some interesting thoughts. And that's why I think the tyranny of the majority is a perfectly good idea to try and think about, because whereas you rightly say that the tyranny, the tyrant in the polity would be the way it worked today, or 200 years ago when Mill was writing, we're living in a completely different world where despite these differences, some of the ideas have a resonance because they help us explain, and the kind of tyranny majority and the kind of way that to some extent kills an independent spirit, and some of the things that I talked about that Aristotle has said, I think is useful in looking at that. You might say that there are actually quite bits of Mill that are not very much use anymore a couple of centuries later, but I would still argue that going back and reading Mill, even for the bits that are not useful, still help us understand the world today. So there's this kind of, it's not black and white. So that, in that spirit, I think Dennis's idea that we should look at things like the European Union and ask is kind of underlying a tyrant. Well, I mean, I don't think I'd call her a tyrant, but I do think that the EU creates some of the conditions that Aristotle talked about in terms of what was needed for the preservation of a tyranny. So you might come to the rule of law, I think, is interesting in that respect, because the EU, I would argue, definitely creates laws in the interests of an EU elite to govern how the populace works. So they're not made for the populace, they're made in the interests of an EU elite, which is not, in the traditional understanding of the way that the rule of law works, is not the way it's meant to be. So I think there's something in your what you say about the kind of regulatory. Again, I think tyrant is perhaps not the right word to use, just as I don't think necessarily woke was the right word for me to use in describing a tyranny. But we have to grapple with some of these issues. So
I'll let you come. Sorry, I'll let you come back on that challenge afterwards.
Okay.
But I'll just do a last round from the audience. So anyone who has a point, so over there, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to develop on Alastair's point a little in regards to Edmund's argument. On the point of change and change in history, I think maybe some people might recognise the fact that society has changed so much because of stuff like being able to text someone in America in a few seconds. We have sort of a completely different understanding of existence now, and we have almost godlike powers, it would have been completely insane to someone 100 years ago. And I think with something like that, it's much easier to have maybe a bit more of a, in regards to tyranny, a bit more of a, or at least oppression, a collective consciousness about fear. And I think what exists is a very underlying collective consciousness of fear in people about what is right and what is wrong. In that sense, I'd like to posit that maybe the tyranny has arrived before the tyrant now.
Mm-hmm.
So the other way around, which is much more classical.
Very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to go back to the question at the beginning of like, what do we want freedom for? In the sense that I think a lot of the questions that have kind of come up about uncertainty and almost like society is kind of tired of like asking the existential questions of where we're going. It's almost because we did work so hard to kind of liberate people to the point where they deconstructed the institutions and the values around them, like not just like the family and religion and stuff, and they saw it as kind of oppressive and allowing in so much of a negative way now that I think a lot of younger generations are kind of coming out of that and going like, well, what are we actually using this freedom for? And so that's why there's this kind of turn or maybe an allowance for younger people to go into tyranny. So like the question is, now we've kind of come to this point, where are we going to go from here? Are we going to kind of use it in a positive way or kind of go backwards?
Yeah. Oh, yes, there.
Yes, I think whenever there's a discussion about is this insert word happening, you have to go back to the definition of the word. So this is the tyranny, which is the oppressive or cruel rule or governance of people contingent on there being a tyrant. No, I think that no, because tyrant is a separate word. And we may understand that to be a necessarily in the classical sense of tyranny, well, there has to be a tyrant, the tyrannical king, you know, whether that's Louis the 14th or Kim Jong-il, now Kim Jong-un even in North Korea. Now, that I don't think that, you can have tyranny in the sense of the Kafkaesque sense of the trial of a bureaucratic, sclerotic system which creates all these rules and is autopoietic. In other words, it creates it creates rules in order to justify its own existence. That out of touch with what the people want in a democracy, and that is just as tyrannical. But that is tyranny in the absence of maybe a specific figurehead of that tyranny, a tyrant.
Very interesting. I saw a last hand there. No. Am I wrong? Oh, yes, Omar.
Yeah. We've been talking a lot about tyranny of fear, but I wanted to go to the other side. In Brave New World, it was a tyranny, but it wasn't based on fear, it was more based on drugs and happiness and towards the end, sex. And that got me thinking, if you look kind of recently to what we would consider woke, a lot of it is not really based on fear, it's more based on goodwill, care, looking after others. Obviously, the Higher Education Act has been recently passed. A lot of universities are releasing their new freedom of speech called codes and practices, of which I was looking at my old university, and one of the things they were putting there is that freedom of expression will be respected unless it hurts the human rights of others. Now, on the surface, that looks like a good, carefree thing. Let's not harm the human rights of others. But where the tyranny comes into that thing is, what do we consider? So if I were to say trans people should not go to, trans women should not go to men's toilets, am I hurting their human rights? So I wanted to ask you guys, what do you think of that type of tyranny? The tyranny that's not based on fear, but on goodwill?
Yeah, I think it also comes sort of full circle to some of the questions we heard first about comfort and the kind of there's the fear that everyone feels, but there's also the fact that we live in an incredibly comfortable society and what that means for our own sense of feeling tyrannized. So I think I might bring it back in the order that you spoke. So some last comments from you, Edmund, and then Alastair. So take it away.
Thank you. Lots of things to cover.
You don't have to take all of them. I just want to kind of
I'm
wrap
not
up a
going
little bit.
I'm afraid. I'd love to, but we'd be here all night.
Take it in the pub afterwards.
Yes, absolutely. I'm looking forward to it. So Alastair was talking about Aristotle, and we had somebody brought up Hobbes earlier, and there was also a question about chaos. And we've also now had comfort. So we've got various things, Aristotle and Hobbes, chaos and comfort. So Aristotle presents, I think, very much the sense of tyranny which I have been advocating for, and which I think is a real thing in the modern world, and is becoming more common and more dangerous with every year passes. Hopefully that trend will change, but at the moment it hasn't. Hobbes changed the game really on political theory, because Hobbes objected very strongly to what he called the democratic views of the Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle and Xenophon, etc., etc. And he objected to it because he believed that the word tyranny was being used as a catch-all term, as it is today, as we've seen this evening, for everything, but particularly for any government that people didn't like. Charles I was executed because he was supposedly a tyrant, even though he was a rightful king. So he objected to this and said that there's only two things. There is chaos, the state of nature, or there is the Leviathan. And the Leviathan is the sovereign state. So he said that it was the necessity of building the state. But he failed to recognize that the state can have two natures. And the ancients regarded these two natures as the tyrannical or the kingly nature. And in a democracy, a demos, in a democracy, the people can also be effectively a king, or it can be effectively a tyrant. So he failed to realize that these institutions, which make sure that our bins are collected and do lots of very nice things, can also be turned to evil ends. And he removed the moral element from the discussion of tyranny. And this is the real problem. This is where I think we misunderstand tyranny a lot. Because people will say, oh, tyranny is just it's only concerned with morality, so it's really just a rhetorical term for something we don't like, for something we view as being bad. And that is how it's used, and that's what Hobbes criticized. But actually, the ancient Greeks saw it in two ways. They saw that it had an institutional element, and that institutional element was the concentration of power, and state power specifically, not any power below the state. So not your abusive husbands, not your abusive bosses, etc., etc. But that this concentration of power naturally led to abuse. In fact, it made abuse almost inevitable. Even if a tyrant did not start out being abusive, they would go through a gradual period of moral degeneracy. So that is why I think chaos is different. Chaos is bad. So we have at least three problems. We can have failing democracies. We can have failed states which completely fall apart, and that's chaos. And very often people bring about tyrants to deal with the problem of chaos. And chaos can be terrible. But actually tyrannies are worse. They're worse than either of those options. And they're the main reason why the happiness, peace, and prosperity of human beings on this planet are currently imperiled or likely to decline. So that's my final
Thank
word.
you very much. Alastair?
Well,
Final thoughts?
tyranny arrives before the tyrant. That the modern way? I mean, I think that's a fair enough way to summarise what I've sort of been suggesting, or playing around with, I think, more than firmly suggesting. That there's a kind of situation just now where there's if you look at what's going on, then you can see some of the conditions that we associate with tyranny, even despite the fact that there's no tyrannical figure in charge. So in that sense, your question of kind of whether it's now the not the individual but the discourse, I think there's something interesting to look at that just now, because I think we can learn something from that. On the happiness. Tyranny of happiness. I mean, I think that's Right, and even to the extent that if you look at social policy over the past 10, 15 years, there's been formalised government policies around creating happiness and creating well-being is a slightly different thing. But there's it's not even in the Brave New World thing of kind of happening informally, but there's actually someone in a department somewhere in up there in Whitehall who's actually thinking about these policies of how is it that we can cultivate through political interventions a state of happiness. I mean, that seems to me to be a reasonably tyrannical way of thinking about the world. But I wanted to finish on the courage question because I think that's important. And I mean, the way I see it is that yes, we need courage because that's the only way that you ever change things. But it's not just kind of physical courage and kind of daring. It's kind of intellectual courage as well, I think, to be able to... It's quite difficult intellectually just now to challenge things. I mean, as soon as you say, like you gave the example of immigration, and as soon as you say anything about immigration, you're instantly labelled a bigot. You know, that's the kind of response to even you might have perfectly legitimate questions that are entirely different from any sort of racist sentiment. Yet the natural way to handle the expression of those sentiments is to create the label that someone is bigoted. So I think in many ways the important bit of courage that we need to discover all the time is intellectually to be able to stand up with the independent spirit that Aristotle said needed to be extinguished because it didn't, you know, that was the way to preserve the tyranny. I think the independent spirit is very, very much worth cultivating, and for all those for that reason, placing ourselves within clubs and educational situations where we demand more knowledge and demand to know friends and colleagues so that we can have some sort of, as a society, independent spirit, not just as individuals, then that seems to me to be a very important way of kind of resisting the tyrannical impulse of lots of what's going on just now, even if it's not a kind of top-down tyranny in the classical sense.
Thank you very much. Can you give my panel a very big hand? I thought that was a great discussion, and as I alluded to earlier, it will be continuing down at the pub. So anyone who wants to join us will be going to the Feathers, which is right now nearby St. James's Park Tube Station. So there's no, you can't get out of this. This is, so just to tell you a little bit, those of you who haven't been to a Living Freedom event before, you are welcome to come up and talk to me. And Alastair, I have some flyers and some brochures to show you a bit of what we do. And some flyers for the event Alastair was talking about earlier, talking about language. So if you want more events like this, please come and talk to us. So thank you all for coming.
But let Alex say something
sorry.
about the...
Yes.
Okay.
I'm very sorry.
Thank you. Well, I think there's quite a few who have shown up. I'm sorry, I should say I lead or I co-organise, along with Laurie, who unfortunately can't make today, the London Free Speech Salon. And we've had a sort of special salon here, one-off. We've brought lots of the members to this wonderful talk. But we usually just meet in a pub near Tottenham Court Road Station. We have talks, debates, whatever you want to call them. It's pretty informal, so all over a drink or two at the pub on a specific subject, controversial, one that really requires free speech, let's say, to discuss properly, more than about free speech itself. Anyway, I organise that. We have our salons about once every 3 weeks on average. Anyway, the main thing is, if you're interested, if it sounds like something that might appeal to you, having drinks at a pub and a little bit of chatter about politics and philosophy, then come to me and I'll be glad to introduce you, tell you more about it.
Thank you very much. Right, can we head down to the pub?
Yeah, I think so.
Excellent idea.
Get a taster of the events. Yes.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. That was really brilliant. That was great. Yeah.
That was very good. I really enjoyed your talk. Very good.
I wasn't